Hey guys! This evening we're diving into the hidden side of winter, where the familiar Christmas tales conceal elements that are much older, much odder, and much stronger than Santa Claus could ever imagine. Long before carolers filled the air with songs, before the peal of church bells, there were women who commanded the icy night. Women with noses like iron and feet resembling those of geese. Women who soared through blizzards in wooden mortars. Women who might grant you a bountiful crop or slice your stomach open and stuff it with rocks. Back then, they weren't known as witches. They were seen as goddesses. And this evening, you'll get to know them from a time before the world labeled them as villains. So, as we prepare to enter this timeless winter scene, I'd appreciate it if you could spread the word to others who might find it useful tonight. If you're liking what you hear, feel free to tap that subscribe button. It makes a real difference. And perhaps, if you're up for it, give it a like or add a comment about your current location while listening. Are you cozied up in bed in California or gazing at snow in Michigan? No matter where, I'd love to hear. For now, lower those lights. Allow the space to slip into that ideal snug dimness. And let's venture together into a winter that predated any written records. Shut your eyes briefly and picture this. It's the height of winter in the highlands of old Europe. It could be in what's now Austria or Switzerland, or the dense woods that later formed Germany. The exact year isn't relevant since this precedes our modern calendar system. Before Christianity spread, before Rome's collapse, before maps had borders or weekdays had names, the snow lies thick, so thick the settlement is almost engulfed. The sun hardly climbs over the horizon, giving just a handful of dim, pale hours before night engulfs all once more. And in that night, folks cluster near fires that feel too weak, too delicate against the immense chill closing in from every direction. They're frightened, not by wolves, although wolves prowl nearby, not by hunger, though supplies are dwindling. They're scared of her, the one who strides across realms, the one who arrives on the breeze and checks if you've upheld your vows. If your home is tidy, if you've turned all your flax into yarn as you promised, if you've respected the ancient customs. Her name, among several, is Berchta, or at times Holla or Perchta in certain tongues, though that version emerges later, altered by years, and dread into something sharper. But in these early days, she is Berchta, and the name signifies the luminous one, the radiant one, which seems odd, doesn't it? Since when we picture witches, particularly those tied to Christmas, we envision gloom, silhouettes, bent noses, and pots simmering with awful brews. But Berchta didn't originate in gloom. She arose in brilliance, in the glow of new snow beneath a full moon, in the sparkle of ice on naked limbs, in the initial pure light following the year's longest night. She was lovely once, or perhaps she remains so, based on your perspective. The ancient tales portray her at times as a young woman in white, with flowing hair like birch bark in the springtime. She strolls the woods, and the creatures recognize her. Deer stay put. Birds perch on her arms. The trees appear to lean her way, acknowledging their protector. Because that's her role, you know. A protector, a guardian. She safeguards the woodland and all its untamed life. She oversees the streams and the hidden spots where existence springs from demise. She leads the spirits of youngsters gone too soon, the unbaptized infants, those who missed their first spring. She collects them to herself, these tiny souls known as the Heimchen, and tends to them in the realm between the living and what follows. She is the deity of transitional spaces, between seasons, especially between the fading year and the emerging one, between living and dying, between the secure, warm dwelling and the perilous wild woods, between slumber and alertness, dream and actuality. And she has guidelines. Oh, she certainly does. You see, in those distant eras, winter wasn't merely chilly, it posed a fundamental risk. If you failed to prepare, if you didn't spin sufficient yarn in autumn for winter garments, if you didn't store enough provisions, if you didn't maintain order in your home and strength in your group, you might perish. Your kids might perish. Your entire community might not endure until spring. So Berchta's guidelines weren't random. They were about endurance. Complete your spinning prior to the 12 days spanning the winter solstice and the new year. Why? Because during those 12 days, you should relax, celebrate, reinforce ties in your group. No room for labor. The labor needed to finish beforehand. Maintain your home neat and organized. Why? Because disorder and grime bred illness, and illness in winter meant death. Set out offerings of nourishment like porridge, bread, milk. Why? Because sharing and thankfulness bound communities when goods were limited. The offerings weren't for a deity literally consuming your food. They served as a prompt to distribute, to consider others, to avoid hoarding. But here's the captivating part, and this is where the narrative truly grabs you. Folks believed in her. They sincerely, deeply believed. They would place those offerings on their thresholds. They would ensure every strand of flax was spun. They would polish their homes until they shone. And during those 12 enigmatic nights, between the winter solstice and Epiphany, when the world paused as if holding its breath, when time seemed odd and fluid, they would strain to hear her. Some swore they detected her, the whir of her distaff in the night, the swoosh of something vast overhead, the groan and creak of the winter gust that might not be gust at all, but the wild hunt. Berchta guiding a parade of spirits across the frozen heavens. And if you were obedient, if you'd followed the guidelines, she could leave a tiny silver coin for you, just a small item. But back then, a silver coin might decide between purchasing seeds for spring or facing starvation. But if you weren't, well, the accounts differ on the consequences of breaking the guidelines, but none are agreeable. Now, let's shift a bit south and west to ancient Rome. It's late December, and the city is bursting with festivities. This is Saturnalia, a 2-week event kicking off near the winter solstice. Slaves and owners swap roles for a day. Folks eat, drink, and exchange presents. There's betting in the streets, and all wear these vibrant pointed caps. And you know, it rings a bell, doesn't it? But here's the detail that ties into our tale. Toward the close of Saturnalia, as the new year neared, folks would ascend the Capitoline Hill to Juno's temple. And there they'd encounter an elderly woman, a seer, a fortune-teller. They'd offer her gifts, food, wine, modest tributes, and she'd foresee their coming year. She'd reveal if they'd enjoy plentiful harvests, strong offspring, wealth. She'd gaze into whatever enigmas old women in holy sites can gaze into. And she'd disclose what the new year brought. Her name is forgotten now, but she was real. We have accounts of this custom. And isn't it curious that a millennium later in Italy, an old woman who flies on a broom and delivers gifts to kids on Epiphany night, La Befana, might echo this ancient Roman practice. Names evolve, details alter, but the prototype endures. The elderly woman who knows, who perceives, who recalls. In ancient Greece, they revered Hecate, the goddess of crossroads and sorcery, with tributes at three-way junctions. In Celtic areas, the Cailleach, the sacred hag, governed the weather and seasonal cycles, ushering in winter with her staff. In Scandinavia, Frigga, Odin's spouse, was linked to spinning and household insight and shared that focus on finished fabric work that Berchta later gained fame for. Are these all one goddess? Varied aspects of the same primordial insight? Experts debate it. But what's evident is this. Throughout Europe, across diverse cultures, languages, and customs, folks grasped that winter held might, and they embodied that might as a woman, typically an elderly woman, usually one connected to spinning, to thresholds, to the sort of insight that stems from enduring many winters and knowing what's required to endure the next. These weren't gentle, sweet fairy godmothers. They were elemental powers. They could be benevolent or harsh, based on if you respected the natural laws of endurance and group harmony. Archaeological finds in the alpine areas have uncovered proof of this veneration. Small shrines, food tributes arranged in particular designs, spinning implements buried ritually, the tangible remains of a faith that viewed the divine in the season's shift and the onset of winter gloom. And the followers of these goddesses weren't backward or silly. They were doing what humans always do, crafting narratives and ceremonies to comprehend forces outside their grasp, to form their anxieties and aspirations for survival. But then a shift occurred, something massive and inexorable and ultimately ruinous. Christianity came, and Christianity had views on goddesses, particularly those adored by women, particularly those tied to wildness and self-reliance, and power not derived from the church or the Bible or any priest's sanction. The church examined Berchta, the luminous one, the forest and child guardian, the preserver of old customs, and the church resolved she must vanish. But you can't simply wipe out a goddess, not when folks have trusted in her for hundreds of years, perhaps thousands. Not when their grandmothers and great-grandmothers set out tributes for her. Not when her rituals are threaded into the essence of winter survival. So the church did something different, something more sly, and frankly, more successful. They converted her into a fiend. They retained the name or a variant. They kept the season. They preserved some guidelines, but they distorted all. They made her grotesque where she'd been lovely, horrifying where she'd been strict but equitable. They took a goddess of radiance and equilibrium and reshaped her into a horror. Berchta became Perchta. The radiant one became the gut cutter, and the narratives shifted. Now she didn't deposit silver coins for the compliant. Now she might still do so. But that's not what the narrative stressed anymore. The narrative stressed what she did to the non-compliant, how she would sneak into your home during those 12 nights, how she would cut your belly with a lengthy blade, how she would extract your innards and cram the space with straw and stones, and refuse, then stitch you up and abandon you for your kin to discover come morning. The narrative stressed the kids she would abduct, cramming them into a bag, their legs sticking out the top as a caution to others. These narratives stressed her misshapen foot, at times a goose foot signifying her as a changer of forms, something not wholly human, or her iron nose keen as a bird's beak, or her tattered garments and frightful look. They ensured folks were terrified, not reverently watchful, the way you might be watchful of nature's mighty force, but terrified, panic-stricken, the sort of terror that fosters obedience. And here's the harshest aspect. They made it about idleness, about household shortcomings, about failing as a housekeeper or spinner or dutiful spouse and child. Where Berchta's guidelines had concerned group endurance, Perchta's guidelines became about regulating women's conduct, about keeping them worn out with home duties, about arming men and clergy with a tool. Better complete that spinning or Perchta will come for you. The goddess who had shielded women, who'd provided them a strong figure to relate to, who had declared, "Your labor counts, your home skills are holy, winter endurance relies on you," was twisted into a bludgeon to strike them with. And the most sorrowful part, it succeeded. But we're jumping ahead. That's a tale for further along in our path. The tale of how the church fought a centuries-long battle against these winter women, how they converted adoration into horror, how they took the burning times and witch trials and tens of thousands of deaths and ensured that, by the end, folks had nearly forgotten there were ever goddesses at all. Only fiends, only witches. But tonight, at this moment, I want you to recall something. Before the terror, before the oppression, before the church concluded that powerful women, even legendary ones, were too risky to exist, there was radiance, there was luminosity, there was a figure who traversed realms and grasped the secrets of endurance, who gathered lost youngsters to her heart and led souls safely onward, who requested only that you fulfill your labor, uphold your vows, and respect the season's turn. There was a goddess, and her name meant bright, shining, the one who lights the gloom. Keep that vision, because we're about to observe what transpires when fear and authority and religious fervor decide that a radiant goddess must be obliterated. We're about to see one of history's most effective propaganda efforts, one so potent that we're still under its influence today. Every time we imagine a witch with a crooked nose and a pointed hat. But you know what? The goddesses didn't vanish. Not entirely. They endured in pieces, in folk legends, in celebrations that persist today in the Alpine areas, in the way Italian kids still await La Befana, in the way Icelandic youngsters still dread and adore Gryla, in the way Russian tales keep recounting stories of Baba Yaga. The goddesses endured because stories always endure. They evolve. They adjust. They conceal when necessary, but they endure. And on the topic of endurance, we must discuss what followed. Because if you believe the shift of a radiant goddess into a gut-slitting fiend is grim, wait until you learn about the system that enabled it, the texts that were penned, the trials that were conducted, the fires that were ignited. We must discuss the burning times, about the witch hunters, about how a whole continent grew convinced that women, especially older women, independent women, women with knowledge, were allied with the devil himself. We must discuss how 100,000 people were accused of witchcraft in Europe, how tens of thousands died, how 75 to 85% of them were women, how their offense was often nothing more than being old or poor or widowed, or knowing how to prepare healing herbs, or simply being disliked by their neighbors. But more than that, we need to grasp how this links to our Christmas witches, because the effort against Berchta, Perchta, Holla, and all the others wasn't separate from the witch trials. It was the base. It was the trial run. If you could turn a cherished goddess into a dreaded demon, you could do the same to living women. And they did. Envision this. It's the year 1486. Somewhere in Germany, a printer is arranging type for a book. His fingers are inked, and he's laboring by candlelight, because the days are brief this season. He likely has no clue that the book he's printing will become the second most influential book in European history, right after the Bible. He certainly has no clue that this book will cause the deaths of tens of thousands of people, most of them women, most of them innocent. The book is called Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, and if our story about Christmas witches was a tree, this book is the axe that tried to chop it down. But let's step back a bit because this didn't occur overnight. The change of goddesses into fiends, the oppression of women, the creation of what we now call the burning times. This was a gradual ignition pun, fully intended. And yes, I know that's dark humor for a bedtime story, but sometimes you have to chuckle or you'll weep. You know, the reality is, Christianity didn't just march into Europe and instantly persuade everyone to drop their old beliefs. That's not how human culture operates. When Christianity first expanded through the Roman Empire and then into the Germanic and Celtic territories, it met thousands of years of entrenched tradition. Local gods and goddesses, sacred groves, holy wells, festivals linked to the farming calendar. And initially, the church was quite clever about it. They didn't say, cease everything you're doing. They said, continue what you're doing, but let's adjust it slightly. This is called syncretism, and it's intriguing. Winter solstice events became Christmas. Spring fertility rites became Easter. Local gods were rebranded as saints, sometimes retaining the same feast days and all. That sacred well, where people had left offerings to a water goddess for centuries. Now it's St. Bridget's well. Same, same offerings, different label. For a time, this functioned fairly well. The old goddesses like Berchta or Hala, they became vague, less formally venerated, more like folklore. Grandmothers still shared stories about them. People still left out offerings during the 12 nights just in case. But it wasn't precisely worship anymore. It was custom, superstition, cultural habit. The church could have left it there, could have just allowed these figures to fade softly into fairy tales. But the church, and this is key, the church had an issue, a mounting, persistent, increasingly alarmed issue. The church was entirely run by men, supposedly celibate men, who had forsaken women and family and all worldly joys. And yet, everywhere they looked, women had power. Not usually political power, but spiritual power, cultural power. The power of the midwife who delivered babies. The power of the healer who knew herbs to reduce fever or ease pain. The power of the wise woman who recalled the old stories and the old ways. And this is vital. Women had a direct connection to the divine through figures like Berchta, Hala, and all their counterparts. Women could leave an offering and seek a blessing without a priest. Women had their own spiritual traditions unrelated to the church. Can you fathom how menacing that was to an organization built wholly on the notion that God speaks only through official channels, specifically male priests in a hierarchical setup? So the church began to resist, slowly at first, then with growing force. In the 12th century, we start seeing church papers denouncing the worship of Domina Perchta Lady Perchta. They charged believers with adoring her instead of the Virgin Mary, which is noteworthy, right? They didn't say stop believing in false gods. They said, you're adoring her instead of the right her. It was a rivalry between female divine figures for women's loyalty. By the 13th century, the medieval Inquisition was fully active, ostensibly pursuing heretics. But observe what kinds of heresies were pursued. Beliefs about women possessing spiritual authority. Beliefs about the natural world being sacred on its own, not merely as God's creation. Beliefs about magic, which truly meant knowledge the church didn't control. Then the 14th century arrived, and things worsened. In 1348, the Black Death reached Europe. Within 5 years, it killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's people. Picture that. Picture half the folks you know dying in torment, and no one grasping why or how to halt it. People were frantic for explanations, frantic for a culprit. And when people are frantic and terrified, they don't tend to reason well. The church declared, "This is God's punishment. This is what occurs when people deviate from the faith, when they cling to old beliefs, when they deal with demons, and slowly, unavoidably, the old goddesses got ensnared in the fray." By the 15th century, Berchta wasn't merely a folk custom anymore. She was proof of demonic sway. The term Perchta, which got linked to her name, literally means frightening monsters. The luminous goddess became Perchta, head of the Perchta, a swarm of demons. Church leaders preached against her, composed alerts about her, and in 1468, in a document called the Thesaurus Pauperum, which sounds elegant but basically means treasury for the poor, the cult of Berchta was formally banned. Ponder that briefly. Banned. Leaving offerings to a figure your grandmother and her grandmother and her grandmother had left offerings for. Now that's unlawful. That's associating with demons. That could land you in grave trouble. But here's what's both ingenious and malevolent about what the church did. They didn't just obliterate Berchta. They remade her. They kept her in the stories, but they altered what she signified. She still appeared during the 12 nights of Christmas. She still concerned herself with whether your house was clean and your spinning was complete. But now, instead of a goddess enforcing rules that aided communities to survive, she was a demon punishing people for the church's gain. All those rules about household order and finished work. Now, they weren't about winter survival. They were about women being submissive, about women remaining in their role, exhausted, overworked, fearful. And the punishments got vivid. Really vivid. The belly-slitting thing that's not from ancient pagan tradition. That's a Christian creation. The church took a figure women had turned to for centuries and made her a warning about what happens when you don't obey. But wait, it gets worse. Because around the same time, something else was happening. Something that would culminate in one of history's most successful hate campaigns. In 1486, that book I mentioned earlier, Malleus Maleficarum, was published by a German inquisitor named Heinrich Kramer. And honestly, it's one of the most disturbing books ever written. Kramer had actually been expelled from Innsbruck a few years earlier for conducting witch trials that even other church officials thought were excessive. But he was obsessed. He believed that witches, specifically female witches, were everywhere, threatening Christian society. So he wrote a handbook, a detailed systematic guide to identifying, interrogating, and executing witches. It's divided into 3 parts: proving that witchcraft exists, describing the various types of witchcraft, and explaining how to prosecute witches legally, and it is aggressively misogynistic. There are passages in this book that basically argue that women are naturally more susceptible to demonic influence because they're intellectually weaker, more carnal, more deceitful. Kramer quotes the Bible, various saints, ancient philosophers, anything he can use to build his case that women are dangerous. There's this one section where he asks, why is it that women are chiefly addicted to evil superstitions? And his answer, I'm paraphrasing here, is basically because women are imperfect, gullible, and have slippery tongues. He says they're more carnal than men and therefore more likely to make pacts with demons. Now, Here's what's terrifying. Despite some initial pushback from theologians who thought Kramer was going too far, the book became a bestseller. It went through multiple editions. It was consulted by judges and witch hunters across Europe. For nearly 200 years, this book was the go-to guide for finding and killing witches. And remember, 75 to 85% of the people accused were women. Let me give you some numbers, real numbers, because this isn't just folklore anymore. This is documented history. In Germany alone, during what historians call the Burning Times, roughly 1450 to 1750, approximately 100,000 people were accused of witchcraft. Conservative estimates say 40,000 to 60,000 were executed. Some scholars put the death toll even higher. Germany was the epicenter. But witch trials happened everywhere. France, Switzerland, Scotland, Poland, even as far as Iceland. Though interestingly, in Iceland, most of the accused were men. But in most of Europe, overwhelmingly women. And not just any women. Older women. Women over 40. Women who had never married or had children. Widows. Women who knew things. Midwifery. Herbalism. Traditional healing. Let me tell you about one place in particular, because the numbers here are just staggering. St. Maximin. It's a small village in Germany. In 1572, it had a population of about 2,200 people. Nice little community. Probably everyone knew everyone else. And over the next 2 decades, just 20 years, 500 people from this village were burned alive for witchcraft. 500 people out of 2,200. That's nearly 1 in 4. Can you imagine? Can you imagine living in a place where a quarter of your neighbors were executed for witchcraft? Where anyone could accuse anyone, and suddenly you're on trial for your life. This happened during a period of intense religious conflict. Germany and Switzerland were being torn apart by the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Catholics and Protestants were literally going to war over theology. And both sides agreed on one thing. Witches were real and they needed to be eliminated. Martin Luther. Yes, that Martin Luther, the great reformer, endorsed the execution of accused witches. John Calvin, another influential Protestant leader, urged officials to eliminate the race of witches. Not to be outdone, Catholic leaders orchestrated massacres, which then pressured Protestant authorities to intensify their witch hunts to prove they were just as godly. Back and forth. A horrifying arms race of persecution. And here's what connects all of this back to our Christmas witches. The Malleus Maleficarum and the witch trial literature that followed are full of references to Perchta Hall and their demonic entourages. These figures were used as evidence that women who followed old traditions were literally in league with the devil. Court records from Austria and southern Germany describe women confessing usually under torture. It's worth noting to riding with Perchta during the wild hunt, to attending gatherings where Perchta presided to making offerings to her. These confessions were then used to justify execution. The goddess had become a weapon, a tool for destroying women who were inconvenient or independent, or simply unlucky enough to be accused. Now, I want to pause here and ask you something. If you're still listening, and I hope you are, even though this part of the story is heavy, think about this. How do you erase a goddess? How do you take a figure that's been woven into culture for potentially thousands of years and just delete her? You don't, because you can't. Belief doesn't work that way. What you can do is reframe her, recontextualize her, make people afraid to even speak her name, make the story so dark and terrifying that parents stop telling them to children. Make the penalties for believing so severe that people learn to keep their mouth shut. And you do it slowly, over generations. You let the fear accumulate. You let the stories change bit by bit until nobody quite remembers what the original stories were. The church had time. It had institutional power. It had literacy and documentation. While most people relied on oral tradition, the church could write down its version of events. And that's the version that survived in official records. But you know what? The people fought back, not with armies or manifestos, but with stubbornness, with grandmothers whispering to granddaughters, with continuing to leave offerings even when it was illegal, with keeping the festivals alive, even if they had to pretend they were Christian holidays. Now, in the Alpine regions, people kept doing the Perchtenlauf, the runs where men dressed in horned masks and animal skins to scare away the demons of winter. The church tried to suppress these repeatedly in the 17th and 18th centuries. It didn't work. The festivals just went underground for a while, then came back. Because people need these stories. We need ways to process the darkness of winter. We need traditions that connect us to our ancestors. We need figures that embody the wild, untamable forces of nature. You can't kill that with laws and burnings. You can suppress it, twist it, drive it into hiding, but you can't kill it. And that's why, even after centuries of persecution, even after tens of thousands of deaths, even after the church did everything in its power to erase these winter women, they're still here. We're still talking about them. Their stories survived. Berchta became Perchta. Yes, the bright goddess became the belly slitter. But she didn't disappear. She evolved. She adapted. She became something that could survive in a world hostile to her existence. And she's not alone. All across Europe, in every region that had a winter goddess or a Christmas witch, the same pattern emerged: suppress, transform, demonize, but never quite eliminate. In Italy, La Befana kept visiting children. In Iceland, Gryla kept snatching naughty kids. In the Slavic lands, Baba Yaga kept flying through the forest in her mortar. Different names, different details, but the archetype persisted because the archetype is true. Not literally true, but true in the way that myths are true. True to something in the human experience. True to the power of winter, the necessity of preparation, the wisdom that comes with age, the authority that women once held in spiritual matters. The church could rewrite the stories. It couldn't rewrite what made people need those stories in the first place. But I'm getting philosophical, and you're probably getting sleepy, which is good. This is a bedtime story after all. The question is, now that we know how goddesses became monsters, what about the monster herself? What about Perchta in her full, terrifying form? The belly slitter, the Christmas witch who became so feared that her name alone could make children behave. What did she actually do in the stories? What were the rules, the rituals, the desperate attempts people made to appease her? And more than that, why did she become the template? Why did this particular transformed goddess become one of the most feared figures in Alpine folklore? That's where we're heading next. Because if you thought the church's propaganda campaign was dark, wait until you hear what the actual stories became. Wait until you hear about the iron nose and the goose foot and the sack full of crying children. Wait until you hear about Twelfth Night, when she would come to your door and you'd better have that porridge ready. So here's the thing about nightmares. The most effective ones aren't completely fantastical. They're grounded in just enough reality that your brain can't quite dismiss them. A monster under your bed, easy to rationalize away. but a figure who enforces rules you're already supposed to follow, who punishes failures you're genuinely worried about, who appears during a specific liminal time of year when the world already feels strange. That's the kind of nightmare that sticks. Frau Perchta, the version that emerged after centuries of church propaganda and cultural transformation, became exactly that kind of nightmare. And tonight, we need to meet her properly. Not the goddess she used to be, but the creature she became. Because understanding her tells us something profound about how fear works, how stories shape behavior, and why some legends refuse to die even when we desperately want them to. Let's start with her appearance because honestly, it's a masterclass in unsettling imagery. Imagine you're a child in an Austrian village in, say, 1650. It's January 5th, the last of the 12 days of Christmas, the night before Epiphany. Your mother has been frantically cleaning the house for days. Your older sister has been up until midnight every night this week, desperately trying to finish spinning the last of the year's flax into thread. Everyone's tense, snapping at each other. And you being a kid, you ask why everyone's so stressed about housework. And your grandmother, your Oma, sits you down and describes Frau Perchta. She's coming tonight. Your grandmother says she walks through the villages during these 12 nights checking on everyone. And you'll know her when you see her, because she doesn't look like other women. Her nose. And your grandmother might lean in close here, making her voice drop to a whisper. Her nose is made of iron, long and curved like a bird's beak. Some say it's so heavy it pulls her head forward, giving her a perpetual searching posture, like she's constantly sniffing out disobedience. Her feet here, your grandmother might glance down at your own small feet. One of them isn't quite right. It's splayed, webbed like a goose's foot. Or maybe it's just huge and flat from centuries of stomping on unfinished work. Either way, it marks her as something not entirely human, a shapeshifter, someone who exists between categories, between worlds, and her clothes. This detail always struck me as particularly sad. She wears rags, layers upon layers of tattered fabric, patched and repatched. For a figure who demands domestic perfection, she herself is dressed in the cast-offs of the poor. It's almost like she's a mirror of the women she terrorizes, overworked, worn out, reduced to scraps. But don't let the ragged appearance fool you, because hidden somewhere in those clothes is a knife, a long, wicked blade that she keeps sharp for her special task. Now, would you like to know what that task is? This is where your grandmother would pause, maybe look toward the door, as if checking that it's properly latched. Then she'd tell you about the belly slitting. If Frau Perchta found that your family hadn't finished their work, if there was still flax left unspun on the distaff, if the house was dirty, if the children had been lazy or disobedient, she would creep into your house while everyone slept. She would approach the bed of the offending person, and then with her long knife, she would slice open their belly. Here's where it gets truly macabre. She wouldn't just kill them. Death would be too simple, too merciful. No, she would reach inside and pull out their stomach and intestines, all the soft, vulnerable organs, and then she would replace them with straw and rocks and garbage, whatever detritus was lying around. Then she'd sew them back up with coarse thread, like mending a torn sack. Some versions say the victim would wake up during this process, unable to scream, forced to watch. Other versions say they'd only discover what had been done when they woke up in agony, their belly distended and heavy with stones. Can you imagine being told this story as a child? Can you imagine the nightmares? But wait, it gets worse. Because Frau Perchta didn't just come for lazy adults. She had a special interest in children, particularly children who lied. If she discovered a child who'd been dishonest, she would take out pieces of glass, sharp, glittering fragments, and she would scrape out their eyes, just methodically remove their ability to see as punishment for not seeing the truth clearly themselves. And for the truly terrible children, the ones who are not just lazy but actively bad, she carried a sack, a large coarse sack that she wore on her back. She would stuff these children inside, their legs sometimes dangling out over the top as a warning to others. Where she took them, the stories don't always say. Some versions claim she ate them. Others suggest she kept them in some hellish workshop, forcing them to do the work they'd refused to do in life for all eternity. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, this is horrifying. How is this a Christmas story? How did parents tell this to their children? And that's exactly the point. This wasn't entertainment. This was social control. Think about the context. These stories flourished from roughly 1500 to 1800. The height of the witch trial era, yes, but also a time of incredible hardship. The Little Ice Age had made winters brutal. Harvests were failing. Famines were common. People were dying from cold and hunger every winter. In that environment, the old rules about preparation, finish your spinning, keep your house in order, work together as community. Those rules were literally life and death. If everyone in the village didn't pull their weight, if supplies weren't adequate, if work wasn't completed before the deep winter set in, people would die. So the stories about Frau Perchta weren't just scary tales. They were enforcement mechanisms. They were ways of making sure everyone, even children, understood that winter survival required discipline and effort. But here's the insidious part. The church had taken those practical survival rules and weaponized them. They'd attached them to a demonic figure, made them about sin and punishment rather than community and survival. They'd taken the communal aspect. We all work together, so we all survive, and made it individual and terrifying. You work, or you personally suffer eternal torment. And the specificity of the punishments. That's brilliant psychological manipulation. The belly slitting wasn't random violence. It was symbolic. Your stomach is where you process food. And these communities were constantly worried about having enough food. By filling the belly with garbage and stones, the story is saying this is what happens when you waste resources, when you don't do your part. The eye scraping for liars. Again, symbolic. You didn't see the truth, so now you can't see it all. The children in the sack, they're removed from the community. The worst fate imaginable in a time when community meant survival. Every punishment was a metaphor made literal, made visceral, made unforgettable. Now, let's talk about timing, because the when is just as important as the who. Frau Perchta made her rounds during the 12 days of Christmas, specifically between December 25th and January 6th, which is Epiphany. But her main night, the night when she was most dangerous, was January 5th, the 12th night, the last night of the Christmas season. Why then? Well, in the old pre-Christian calendar, this was a liminal time. The winter solstice had passed, meaning the days were technically getting longer, but you couldn't tell yet. It was still dark, still cold, still deadly. The old year was ending, the new year beginning, but you were stuck in this weird in-between space. Ancient peoples across Europe considered these 12 nights to be somehow outside normal time. The veil between worlds was thin. The rules didn't quite apply. It was a dangerous time, a haunted time. People would stay up late. burn extra candles, make protective charms. The Church, in its infinite wisdom, decided to claim this period, make it Christmas, the celebration of Christ's birth. But they couldn't completely erase the older associations with danger and otherworldliness. So instead, they populated it with their own monsters, with Perchta and her demonic followers. And who are these followers? Oh, we need to talk about the Perchtan. Remember how Perchtan literally means scary monsters? Well, these weren't just abstract concepts. In the folklore, Perchta traveled with an entourage, a horde of terrifying beings who accompanied her on the wild hunt through the winter sky. Some sources describe them as demons with horns and wild hair, wearing animal skins, carrying chains and bells that they would shake to create horrible cacophonies. Others describe them as the souls of the unbaptized dead, all those babies who died before they could be brought to the church, now condemned to wander eternally with Perchta. This second interpretation is particularly heartbreaking. Remember, Berchta, in her original form, was supposed to care for these lost children to protect them. The church turned that into something nightmarish. Yes, she's with the dead children, but now they're demons. Now they're threats. Even the protective aspects of the goddess had been corrupted. On certain nights, particularly the 3 Thursdays before Christmas, known as Bercht nights or knocking nights, people claimed they could hear the wild hunt passing overhead. The sound of wind and thunder roaring through the mountains, bells clanging, chains rattling, the screams of captured souls. If you heard this noise, you were supposed to stay inside. Shut all the windows. Don't look out. Because if Perchta or her followers saw you watching, they might decide to take you with them. Can you imagine? You're lying in bed. It's the middle of winter, pitch dark outside, and you hear this terrible noise. Wind maybe or maybe not, and you're supposed to just lie there perfectly still, hoping it passes you by. That's horror movie material right there. But here's what's fascinating. People fought back. Not against Perchta herself. You didn't fight a demon goddess. That would be suicide. But against the fear she represented. Starting in the medieval period and continuing to this day in some parts of Austria and Bavaria, communities developed a tradition called the Perchtenlauf, the Perchten Run. Men would dress up in elaborate costumes, horned masks, animal furs carrying bells and chains, and they would parade through the village making noise and chaos. The idea was, if we dress up as the Perchten ourselves, if we make ourselves scarier than the actual demons, we can frighten them away. Fight fire with fire. Meet terror with terror. There were 2 types of Perchten in these processions. The Schön Perchten, the beautiful Perchten, who wore lighter colors and represented good fortune, and the Schick Perchten, the ugly Perchten, who are truly terrifying and represented the dangerous aspects of winter. The church tried to ban these processions multiple times in the 17th and 18th centuries. They said it was pagan, demonic, a return to old superstitions. But the people refused to stop. They'd take a break when the authorities cracked down, then start up again as soon as the pressure eased. Why? Because they needed it. They needed a way to process the fear, to take back some control, to laugh at the monsters even while half believing in them. And you know what? The Perchtenlauf still happens today. If you go to certain parts of Austria or southern Germany in early January, you can see modern Perchten runs. They've become tourist attractions now, performances rather than rituals. But the masks are still scary. The bells are still loud, and there's still something primal about watching people dressed as demons run through the snowy streets, shaking chains while crowds watch and cheer. The tradition survived everything: church persecution, modern rationalism, centuries of change. It survived because people need ways to acknowledge and confront their fears, even if the fear is now more metaphorical than literal. But let me ask you something. Do you think people really believed in Frau Perchta? Like genuinely believed that a woman with an iron nose and a knife would literally enter their homes and perform surgery with garbage? Or was it something more complex? A kind of willing suspension of disbelief, a way of taking abstract anxieties about winter, about survival, about community cohesion, and giving them a face. I think it was probably both. I think adults probably had a more metaphorical understanding, while children took it literally and were genuinely terrified. I think some people, especially in isolated villages, especially during particularly hard winters, might have convinced themselves they'd seen or heard her. The mind does strange things when it's cold and dark, and you've been told these stories your whole life. And I think that ambiguity was part of the power. You never quite knew. Was that sound just the wind, or was it the wild hunt? Was your neighbor who got sick because of natural causes, or because they'd angered Perchta? Better to be safe. Better to follow the rules. Better to keep the house clean and the work done, and the offerings left out just in case. Which brings us to those offerings. Because yes, even though she was supposedly a demon now, people still left food out for Perchta. Old habits die hard. The traditional offering was a porridge called Perchtenmilch, Perchta's milk. Families would prepare it on the 12th night, eat some themselves, then leave a portion outside or on the doorstep. In the morning, if the porridge was gone or disturbed in specific ways, that was an omen for the coming year. Good signs meant prosperity. Bad signs meant, well, better work harder next year. The church condemned this practice repeatedly. They said it was devil worship, but people kept doing it, often in secret, and they justified it by saying, "We're not worshiping her. We're just being cautious. Can't hurt to be polite to dangerous forces, right?" It's the same logic that has people knocking on wood or throwing salt over their shoulders. Yes, rationally, we know it doesn't do anything, but what if it does? What's the harm in hedging your bets? So, Frau Perchta, this terrifying figure, this belly-slitting demon, this Christmas nightmare, she persisted. Through centuries of change, through the Enlightenment, through industrialization and modernization. Her story got softer over time, fewer belly slittings in the later versions, more emphasis on the gift-giving for good children. But she never quite disappeared. And I find that oddly comforting in a dark way, because it means that even the church's most successful propaganda campaign couldn't completely erase what came before. The goddess survived, even if she survived as a monster. The tradition survived, even if they survived as superstitions. The power survived, even if it survived as fear. But Perchta wasn't alone in this transformation, and she wasn't the only Christmas witch who learned to survive by becoming terrifying. Across Europe, her sisters were undergoing their own metamorphoses. In Italy, a kindly gift giver was learning to balance sweetness with subtle threat. In Iceland, an ogress who predated Christmas was being adopted into the holiday season. In the Slavic lands, an ancient witch was crystallizing into the form we still recognize today. Each of them has their own story, their own rules, their own ways of haunting the winter nights. And each of them tells us something different about fear, survival, and the stories we tell to make it through the dark. You know what's interesting about Italy? While the rest of Europe was busy turning their winter goddesses into belly-slitting nightmares, Italy looked at the same archetype and said, "Hey, what if we made her nice?" Well, mostly nice with just enough edge to keep things interesting. Let me introduce you to La Befana, and I'm going to tell you right now, she's probably my favorite of all the Christmas witches we're going to meet, because her story is proof that not every transformation has to be tragic. Sometimes, just sometimes, the old goddess survives with her power intact and her dignity mostly preserved. She just learns to work within the new system. La Befana is beloved in Italy, and I mean truly deeply beloved. She has festivals, she has parades, she has entire markets dedicated to her. Italian children grow up waiting for her with the same excitement that American kids wait for Santa Claus. Except, you know, she's an old witch who flies on a broomstick and comes down your chimney covered in soot. So yeah, basically exactly like Santa Claus if we're being honest about it. But let's start with the visual, because La Befana is wonderfully, unapologetically witchy in the best possible way. She's old, like properly old, wizened and wrinkled, with a face that speaks of centuries of wisdom, and possibly not enough sleep. Her nose is long and hooked. We can't escape the hooked nose in these stories, can we? And in some depictions, she's got warts. Because of course she does. That's the classic witch aesthetic. And La Befana owns it. She wears layers of ragged clothes, skirts upon skirts, all patched and worn, a shawl around her shoulders, an apron that's seen better days. And here's the delightful detail. She wears a headscarf or sometimes a pointed hat. The pointed hat thing is interesting because that image of witches wearing pointed hats that became standardized in the medieval period. And La Befana is one of the figures who helped cement it in popular imagination. On her feet are worn-out shoes, and on her back is a broomstick. The broomstick serves double duty. She flies on it, obviously, because that's what witches do. But she also uses it to sweep because La Befana is nothing if not practical. And here's my favorite part about her appearance. She's covered in soot. Absolutely covered because she enters homes through the chimney. You see, she's been doing this for so long, visiting so many houses in one night, that she's permanently begrimed with ash and soot, which, if you think about it, makes her the original coal delivery system. Santa Claus is just borrowing her methodology. Now, you might be wondering, why is she so dusty and raggedy if she's supposed to be a beloved figure? Why doesn't she clean up a bit? And that's where the story gets interesting, because La Befana's appearance isn't just random, quirky witch aesthetics. It's a deliberate choice, a statement even. See, according to the most popular legend, La Befana was once an ordinary woman, a housewife, living somewhere in Italy around the time of Jesus' birth. And one night, she heard a commotion outside, people traveling, a lot of people actually following some kind of star. She went to her door, and there were the three wise men, the Magi, on their journey to Bethlehem. They asked her for directions. Some versions say they invited her to come with them to see the newborn king, and she said no. Why? Because she was busy. She had housework to do. The floors needed sweeping. The washing needed finishing. All those domestic tasks that never end, that women have been told for millennia, are their sacred duty and their eternal burden. Come back later, she told them, after I'm done with my chores. But of course, later never came. By the time she finished her endless housework and decided to follow, the wise men were long gone. The star had moved. She'd missed a chance to witness something miraculous because she'd been too caught up in sweeping floors. So now, every year on the night of Epiphany, January 5th, the same night Perchta makes her rounds. Interesting coincidence there. La Befana flies across Italy, still searching, still looking for that baby, still trying to make up for the opportunity she missed. And because she never found Jesus, she visits every child instead. She brings gifts to the good children, toys, candy, fruit. She brings coal to the naughty ones. Though honestly, even her coal isn't real coal anymore. It's candy made to look like coal, because La Befana isn't actually mean-spirited. She's just thorough about the naughty or nice thing. Now, before we go further, can we talk about how genius this legend is as a piece of Christian propaganda? Think about it. Here's a story that takes an ancient pagan figure, probably connected to those same Roman fortune-telling women we talked about in Part 1, the ones who would sit at the temple of Juno during Saturnalia. And it Christianizes her perfectly. It gives her a biblical connection. It makes her forever in service to Christian mythology, but it does so in a way that doesn't demonize her. It makes her sympathetic, relatable, even. Because who hasn't missed an important moment because they were caught up in daily obligations? Who hasn't regretted prioritizing housework over experience? The story of La Befana is at its heart a cautionary tale about not getting so bogged down in the mundane that you miss the miraculous. It's actually kind of beautiful and kind of sad. This woman eternally searching, eternally trying to compensate for one missed moment by being generous to every child she encounters. But here's what I find most fascinating. Italy didn't need to make La Befana terrifying to keep her relevant. She didn't need to become a belly slitter or a child eater. Her power comes from something different. From the guilt and regret she represents, sure, but also from the hope because she's still searching, still trying, still bringing joy to children even though her own heart is presumably sad. That's more emotionally complex than most Christmas figures if we're being honest. So, what does La Befana actually do on her big night? Well, on the evening of January 5th, Italian children go to bed with stockings hung up, usually by the fireplace, but sometimes just near a window or door. They might leave out a small snack for La Befana. Some families leave wine and local food, maybe some sausage or broccoli, which apparently La Befana is fond of. It's like milk and cookies for Santa, but with more Italian flair. Then, La Befana comes flying on her broomstick across the Italian countryside and cities. She lands on rooftops, squeezes down chimneys, getting absolutely filthy in the process, and fills the stockings. Good children get treats, candy, small toys, fruit like oranges and tangerines. Bad children get coal or garlic or onions, which I have to say, garlic and onions as punishment is very Italian. You've been bad. So, here's ingredients that will make your mother's house smell for weeks. That'll teach you. And here's a lovely detail. In some traditions, La Befana also sweeps the floor before she leaves. With her broomstick, she tidies up because old habits die hard, and she's still that housewife at heart, unable to leave a house without at least a little cleaning. Isn't that kind of heartbreaking? Even in her mythical form, even as this powerful gift-giving witch, she can't escape the domestic labor she was trapped in. But Italian children don't see it as sad. They see it as a sign of her care. She's not just bringing gifts. She's taking care of their homes. She's nurturing in a very practical, hands-on way. Now, the question is, where did La Befana really come from? Is the Christian legend the whole story, or is there something older underneath? Historians are pretty confident there's something older. That connection to Saturnalia and the Roman fortune-tellers is well documented, but there's also possibly a link to a Roman goddess named Strenua, or Strenia, who was associated with the new year and well-being. Strenia had a shrine on the Via Sacra, the main street of ancient Rome that led to Capitoline Hill. And here's where it gets interesting. The word for gifts in Latin was strene, directly derived from this goddess's name. Later, this evolved into words in Italian dialects for New Year's gifts. The practice of giving strene during the New Year period in ancient Rome, particularly to children, is remarkably similar to what La Befana does. It's also worth noting that Befana itself is likely a corruption of Epiphania, Epiphany. The religious feast was named, and the old goddess figure got renamed to match it. Same pattern we've seen elsewhere. Keep the tradition, change the label, hope people forget where it really came from. But Italians didn't forget. Or if they did, they didn't care. La Befana persisted through centuries of church control, through the Renaissance, through the unification of Italy in 1871, through fascism, through everything. She's still here, and she's celebrated. Oh, is she celebrated? Let me tell you about Urbania, a small town in the March region of Italy. Every year from January 2nd to 6th, Urbania throws what is possibly the biggest Befana festival in the country. It's 4 days of markets, performances, food, and Befana-themed everything. They have a Casa della Befana, Befana's house, where children can visit and meet an actress dressed as La Befana herself. Imagine that. A whole house dedicated to an old witch. Inside, she sits and talks to children, asks them if they've been good, maybe tells them a story or two. It's magical and slightly spooky, and entirely wonderful. The streets are filled with market stalls selling Befana dolls, Befana-themed crafts, and of course, carbone dolce, sweet coal, because the Italians turned even the punishment into a treat. That's the Italian way. Everything should be delicious, even discipline. There are performances throughout the festival. People dress up as Befana. There are parades. At night, there are projections and light shows. The entire town commits to the celebration. And Urbania isn't the only place. Venice, because Venice has to be extra about everything, holds a Befana regatta. Yes, a boat race. Men dress up as old witches, full costume, the works, and race each other in boats down the Grand Canal. Can you picture it? The Grand Canal, that beautiful historic waterway filled with boats piloted by men in drag, dressed as raggedy old witches, racing each other while crowds cheer from the banks. It's absurd and glorious, and somehow perfectly Venetian. In Rome, in Piazza Navona, there's a Christmas market that extends through Epiphany, and it's full of Befana stalls. You can buy Befana dolls in every size imaginable, from tiny ones that fit in your palm to massive ones as tall as a child. Some are cute and cartoonish. Others are genuinely witchy and a bit creepy. All over Italy, schools teach children the Befana legend. Families have their own traditions around her visit. And notably, this is important. She hasn't been Disneyfied or corporatized or made safe and bland. She's still a witch, still covered in soot, still a little bit scary around the edges. Italian parents don't shy away from the witch aspect. They lean into it. Because La Befana is powerful precisely because she's not some sanitized fairy. She's old, she's weathered, she's been through stuff. And she's still out there working. She's earned her place in the culture. And I think there's something really beautiful about that. In a world where we're constantly told that women lose value as they age, where older women are often rendered invisible in stories and media, here's a figure who is celebrated specifically as an old woman. Her age is her power, her experience, her weariness, her regret, her persistence. All of it matters. All of it is part of why she's beloved. She's not trying to be young or beautiful. She's not competing with anybody. She's just herself, an old woman with a job to do, doing it year after year after year, because someone has to bring gifts to the children, and she's volunteered for the position. There's also something wonderfully feminist in a quiet, understated way about La Befana's whole deal. She's completely independent. She has no husband, no family, no one telling her what to do. She's literally flying around by herself all night, breaking into people's houses, doing her thing. She makes all the decisions about who's naughty and nice. She's not Santa's wife or Santa's helper, or waiting for some man to validate her existence. She's her own entire operation, a solo act, and Italy loves her for it. Now, does La Befana have a dark side? Is there anything scary about her? Well, kind of. In some regional variations, there are hints of the old goddess's sterner nature. Some versions say that if children are truly terrible, not just naughty, but genuinely bad, La Befana might take them away with her, stuff them in her sack along with the coal and garlic. But honestly, these versions are rare and getting rarer. Modern La Befana is overwhelmingly benevolent. The worst she'll do is leave you vegetables, which I suppose for a child is pretty devastating. The scariest thing about her is probably just her appearance. That witchy look, the soot, the way she comes down your chimney in the middle of the night. If you woke up and saw an old woman covered in ash standing in your living room holding a broomstick, that would be startling regardless of her intentions. But children seem to love that combination of slightly spooky and ultimately safe. It's like a very gentle form of thrill-seeking. La Befana is just dangerous enough to be exciting, but not so dangerous that anyone's actually afraid. And maybe that's why she survives so well in Italy, while other winter goddesses got demonized elsewhere. Maybe Italy found the sweet spot. Keep her witchy enough to be interesting, but make her kind enough to be loved. Or maybe Italians just have a better sense of balance about these things. A more nuanced relationship with the sacred and the mundane, the fearsome and the familiar. After all, this is a country where Catholic churches are full of bones and mummified saints, where religious processions carry statues of martyrs with arrows sticking out of them, where the sacred and the macabre have always danced together. In that context, a soot-covered old witch who brings candy and occasionally garlic. That's wholesome family entertainment. But here's my favorite thing about La Befana. The thing that makes her story different from so many others we'll encounter. She's successful not in terms of her eternal quest. She's still searching for that baby, still trying to fix her mistake, but successful in terms of cultural survival, in terms of being loved and celebrated, rather than feared and eventually forgotten. She's proof that the old goddesses could adapt, could find new forms, could thrive even in a culture dominated by Christianity. She didn't have to become a monster to persist. She just had to be useful and flexible and willing to accept a slightly revised origin story. Is it a compromise? Sure. The Christian framing of her legend is clearly imposed, a way of bringing her under the church's umbrella. But it's a compromise that let her survive, that let Italian children continue to have a gift-giving witch as part of their holiday traditions, that let old women see themselves represented in a beloved cultural figure. Sometimes compromise isn't defeat. Sometimes it's strategy. And La Befana, she's been playing the long game for over 1,000 years. While other goddesses were being erased or demonized, she was sweeping chimneys and filling stockings and making herself indispensable. You can't cancel someone who's bringing your children presents. You can try, but good luck explaining to the kids why La Befana isn't coming anymore. She's clever. Our Befana witch clever. Goddess clever. the kind of clever that looks like simplicity but is actually profound survival skill. But not every Christmas witch had La Befana's luck. Not every culture found that balance between honoring the old ways and adapting to the new order. Up north, way up in the harsh, volcanic landscape of Iceland, another winter woman was emerging from ancient stories. And this one didn't compromise. This one didn't soften. This one said, "You want a monster? I'll show you a monster." And Iceland decided to keep her exactly as terrifying as she'd always been. If you've ever been to Iceland, or even just seen pictures, you know it's not a gentle place. This is a land of volcanoes and glaciers existing side by side, where the earth itself can split open and bleed lava, where winter darkness lasts for months, where the wind doesn't just blow, but actively tries to push you off cliffs. It's a landscape that makes you understand on a visceral level that humans are just tenants here, temporary guests in a world run by forces far more powerful and ancient than we'll ever be. So when Iceland needed a Christmas monster, they didn't go for anything cute or redeemable. They went for something that matched their landscape. Primal, uncompromising, absolutely terrifying. They went for Gryla. And let me tell you right now, if there was a competition for scariest Christmas figure, and honestly there should be, that would be amazing. Gryla would win, not even close. Krampus would take one look at her and run home to Austria crying for his mother. Because Gryla doesn't just punish bad children. She doesn't just threaten them or leave them cold. No. Gryla hunts them down, catches them, stuffs them in a sack, carries them back to her cave in the mountains, and makes them into stew. Yes, stew. Like actual cannibalistic child stew. She has a recipe and everything. Iceland doesn't mess around with their folklore, folks. Now, before we get into the delicious, terrible details of Gryla's culinary preferences, we need to understand where she came from. Because unlike Perchta or Befana, who are gradually absorbed into Christmas traditions, Gryla existed for centuries before she had anything to do with the holiday season. The earliest written references to Gryla appear in 13th century Icelandic sagas and poems. We're talking around 1200 AD, maybe earlier in oral tradition. And in these early mentions, she's not a Christmas figure at all. She's something far more fundamental, the personification of winter itself. One old Icelandic poem describes her coming down in the field with 15 tails. Another says, "Down comes Gryla from the outer fields with 40 tails, a bag on her back, a sword or knife in her hand." 15 tails, 40 tails. The numbers vary wildly because that's how oral tradition works, but the image is consistent. Something massive, something with too many parts, something wrong, something that shouldn't exist but does. She wasn't just scary, she was the embodiment of Iceland's harsh reality. When winter came, real winter, the kind that could kill you if you weren't prepared, that was Gryla descending from the mountains. The cold, the darkness, the threat of starvation, the isolation, all of it personified as this monstrous woman. And this is crucial to understand. In Iceland, more than almost anywhere else in Europe, the people saw themselves as guests in a hostile world. The land itself was alive, powerful, dangerous. Glaciers could shift and crush entire settlements. Volcanic eruptions could destroy farmland. The sea could swallow boats without warning. Earthquakes, avalanches, blizzards. Iceland has them all. So the idea that there were beings more powerful than humans, beings who actually controlled the landscape, that wasn't superstition. That was just acknowledging reality. Gryla wasn't a myth you believed or didn't believe. She was the winter, and winter was real. Now let's talk about what Gryla actually looks like, because the descriptions are wonderfully horrifying. She's huge, not just tall, but massive. Some accounts say she's a troll or an ogress, which in Icelandic folklore means something with gigantic proportions. We're talking 20, 30 ft tall, big enough that her footsteps shake the ground. She's hideous. Multiple sources emphasize this. We're not talking unconventionally attractive or rustic charm. We're talking genuinely monstrous. Some descriptions give her multiple heads. Others say her face is so deformed it barely looks human. Her features are exaggerated, twisted, nightmare fuel material. And remember those tails? Those aren't cute little appendages. These like tentacles or extra limbs writhing and grasping. Some versions say she uses them to carry children. Others suggest they're for climbing mountains or grabbing multiple victims at once. Either way, deeply unsettling. She carries a sack, a huge coarse sack that she wears on her back. And in that sack, she collects her prey. Naughty children. Their legs dangle out the top as she walks back to her cave. Little feet kicking helplessly, visible to anyone who happens to witness her passage as a warning. And she lives. This is important. She lives in a cave in the highlands. The Icelandic highlands are not a cute place to live. They're desolate, barren, rocky. Barely anything grows there. It's the kind of landscape that feels hostile to life, which makes sense because Gryla is hostile to life. That's kind of her whole thing. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Gryla has a family, a highly dysfunctional family, as folklorist Terry Gunnell calls it, but a family nonetheless. She has a husband, or rather, she's had multiple husbands. The early stories mention that she ate one of her husbands when she got bored with him. Just straight up cannibalized him, which according to Gunnell makes her the first feminist in Iceland. I'm not sure that's the kind of feminism we should aspire to, but you have to admire the independence. Her current husband, as of the last few centuries of folklore, is called Lepaludi. He's also a troll, but he's kind of useless. In most modern depictions, he's lazy and doesn't do much except sit around their cave. Gryla is very much the one in charge. And then she has sons, 13 of them. They're called the Yule lads, Jólasveinar in Icelandic, and each one has a different name that describes his particular brand of mischief or theft. There's Stekkjastaur, sheepcoat Clod, who harasses sheep. There's Giljagar, Gully Gawk, who hides in gullies waiting to steal milk. There's Stufur, Stubby, who's abnormally short and steals pans to eat the crust left on them. There's Thvorisleikir, Spoon Licker, who, well, you can probably guess. Each name is delightfully specific and weird, and traditionally they come down from the mountains, one per night, during the 13 nights leading up to Christmas. Each one causes a different kind of havoc. Then they leave one per night after Christmas in reverse order. They're not exactly evil, these Yule lads. More like mischievous and annoying. Think less terrifying monster and more troublesome teenagers, which if Gryla is their mother, that tracks. Even ogresses have to deal with their kids going through phases. Oh, and the family also has a pet, a cat, but not a cute cat. Not a cuddly Christmas cat. The Yule cat. Jólakötturinn is gigantic and eats people. Specifically, it eats people who don't receive new clothes before Christmas. There's an old tradition in Iceland that everyone should get at least one new piece of clothing for Christmas, even if it's just socks. And if you don't, the Yule cat will eat you. This tradition apparently started as a way to motivate farm workers to finish processing the autumn wool. If you worked hard, you'd get new clothes made from that wool. If you were lazy, well, giant cat food. The Icelandic singer Björk actually recorded a song about the Yule cat using lyrics from a famous Icelandic poem. It's hauntingly beautiful and deeply creepy, which is very on brand for both Björk and Iceland. So, let's recap. We have Gryla, the child-eating ogress, her lazy troll husband, their 13 troublemaking sons, and a giant man-eating cat. This is Iceland's Christmas family, and you know what? Icelanders love them. But here's the crucial historical detail. Gryla didn't become associated with Christmas until the 19th century. Before that, she was purely a winter figure, showing up whenever the cold came, not tied to any specific date or holiday. It was only in the early 1800s that poets and storytellers started connecting her to Christmas specifically. The Yule lads, who'd been standalone troublemakers in older folklore, got adopted as her sons around the same time. The Yule cat joined the family later still. Why did this happen? Why did Iceland decide to bring together all these disparate scary figures and make them into one Christmas family? Partly because of Christianity's influence. Sure, the church wanted to claim the entire winter season, make it all about Christmas. So, the old winter figures got absorbed into the Christmas narrative just like everywhere else. But I think there's another reason, too. Iceland was colonized later than most of Europe. It was more isolated. The old beliefs hung on longer there, existing alongside Christianity rather than being completely replaced by it. And when Icelanders did start adopting Christmas traditions more fully, they didn't want to give up their old figures. They wanted to keep what was theirs. So instead of erasing Gryla, instead of softening her into something more palatable or Christian, they just relocated her to Christmas. Changed the timing, but not the essential character. She's still a child-eating ogress. She's still terrifying. She's just a Christmas child-eating ogress now. It's a very Icelandic solution, honestly. Practical, straightforward, no nonsense. Now, you might be wondering, do Icelandic children actually find Gryla scary? Or has she become like a cartoon character, something kids laugh at? According to Brian Pilkington, a children's book illustrator who works with Icelandic folklore, children are truly terrified of Gryla in Iceland. He's visited preschools to demonstrate drawing. And when he draws Gryla, 2 or 3 terrified children have to leave the room because it's too strong for them. This is living folklore, he says. Not historical curiosity, not academic study. Living, breathing, actually believed, at least on some level, folklore. Folklorist Terry Gunnell confirms this. She's never stopped being embraced here. As a living figure, you see her all around Reykjavik. There are statues of her, artwork. She appears in shop windows at Christmas, not as kitsch or irony, but as a genuine part of the culture. And here's what I find absolutely fascinating. In the 19th and 20th centuries, there was an attempt to soften these figures, to make them less scary, more child-friendly. The Yule lads, in particular, got a makeover. They became more like mischievous elves than troublemaking trolls. They started leaving small gifts for children in shoes left on windowsills. One gift from each lad during their 13-night visit. Gryla got a bit softer, too. In some retellings, she became more of a threat than an active danger. Be good, or Gryla will get you. Rather than Gryla actively hunts bad children through the streets. But in recent years, and this is the really interesting part, There's been a deliberate effort to bring back the scarier versions to reclaim the original terror of these figures. Modern Icelandic festivals, parades, and celebrations increasingly feature Gryla and her family in their full frightening forms. The Yule lads are getting more troll-like again. Gryla is being portrayed with her full monstrous features, not watered down. Why? Why would a culture deliberately make their Christmas tradition scarier? I think it's because Iceland recognizes something important. Fear has value, not trauma, not genuine terror that damages children, but the kind of controlled fear that comes from scary stories told safely, the kind that lets you experience danger without actual risk, the kind that teaches you the world is bigger and stranger and more powerful than you. And that's okay. That's just reality. Iceland's landscape teaches this lesson constantly. You can't live in Iceland and believe humans are the masters of nature. The land won't let you maintain that delusion. So having Christmas traditions that embody that same truth, that there are forces beyond your control, that winter is dangerous, that you're small in a big world, that's not cruelty. That's honesty. And maybe it's also cultural preservation. Maybe Icelanders looked around at how other countries had sanitized their folklore, turned their monsters into mascots, and said, "No thank you. We're keeping ours real." There's also something beautifully subversive about Gryla, specifically because she's female. She's in charge. She's the powerful one in her family. Her husband is basically useless, and her sons are still living at home causing trouble. She's the matriarch, the one with agency and power. In a world where most Christmas figures are male, Santa Claus, Krampus, St. Nicholas Gryla is unabashedly, terrifyingly female. She's not a helper or a wife or a sidekick. She's the main event. And Iceland hasn't tried to diminish that power to make her more acceptable. You don't mess with Gryla. That's her whole deal. And Iceland is perfectly comfortable with a female figure being that scary, that powerful, that unchallengeable. Now, do modern Icelandic parents actually tell their children that Gryla will eat them? Do kids genuinely believe a troll woman is going to stuff them in a sack? It's complicated. Most Icelandic children know Gryla is a story, but they also kind of believe it. The way children believe things, the way belief exists in that magical space of probably not real. But what if, and more importantly, they grow up with her as a cultural touchstone? She's part of being Icelandic, part of the shared identity. When winter comes and the darkness settles in for months, Gryla is out there somewhere in the highlands, not literally maybe, but emotionally, psychologically. She represents what winter means in Iceland. Beautiful, yes, but also deadly serious. There's a respect built into the folklore, a respect for winter, for darkness, for the dangerous aspects of existence that can't be controlled or softened or made safe. And I think that's why Gryla has survived when so many other winter goddesses were either destroyed or diminished. She serves a function, she tells a truth. And Iceland decided that truth was worth preserving, even if it meant their Christmas traditions would be more nightmare fuel than sugar plums. Because honestly, a Christmas that acknowledges darkness alongside light, danger alongside celebration, fear alongside joy, that feels more complete somehow, more honest, less sanitized. Gryla doesn't promise you everything will be okay. She doesn't tell you that if you're good, you'll be rewarded. She tells you that winter is hard, life is dangerous, and you'd better take it seriously. But she also tells you something else, something more subtle. You can survive this. Icelanders have survived this for over 1,000 years, living in one of the harshest environments on Earth. telling stories about an ogress in the mountains. And they're still here, still thriving, still finding beauty and joy and community even in the darkest winters. If they can survive with Gryla hanging over them, you can survive whatever winter you're facing too. And speaking of survival, speaking of powerful female figures who refuse to be erased or softened, we need to head east now to the vast forests of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and beyond. Because there's another witch waiting in the woods, one who's been there far longer than Christianity, far longer than Christmas, far longer than almost any other figure we'll encounter. She's complicated, contradictory, simultaneously the most terrifying and most helpful creature in Slavic folklore. She flies in a mortar, steers with a pestle, and lives in a hut that walks on chicken legs. And her name: there's a hut in the forest, deep in the forest, where the trees grow so thick that sunlight barely penetrates, where the path disappears, and even the birds seem reluctant to sing. And this hut, it's not like other houses. It doesn't sit on a foundation. It doesn't rest peacefully on the ground. No, this hut stands on chicken legs, giant chicken legs, and it spins. It rotates constantly, restlessly, as if it's looking for something or running from something. And around this impossible house is a fence made of human bones, topped with skulls that glow in the darkness like terrible lanterns. Inside lives the most famous witch in Eastern European folklore, the one who's inspired more stories, more art, more nightmares than perhaps any other female figure in Slavic mythology. She's older than Christianity in these lands, older than written history. She might be older than memory itself. Her name is Baba Yaga, and if you think you understand her after just that description, you're wrong. Because Baba Yaga is the most contradictory, confounding, endlessly fascinating figure we're going to encounter. She'll help you or eat you, guide you or destroy you, and you won't know which until it's happening. Let's start with her name, because names matter, and this one is delightfully ambiguous. Baba in most Slavic languages means grandmother or old woman. It's actually kind of a casual, familiar term, like how you might call your grandmother Gran or Nana. So that part seems straightforward enough. But Yaga, that's where it gets interesting. Scholars have been arguing about this for over a century. Some think it comes from an old Slavic word related to serpent or snake. Others connect it to words meaning horror, shudder, or chill. In Polish, there's Jeza, which means witch or evil woman. In Old Church, Slavonic Jesa meant disease. One fascinating theory traces it to the Sanskrit word ahi, also meaning serpent, suggesting these linguistic roots go way, way back, which would make Baba Yaga potentially one of the oldest continuously existing figures in Indo-European mythology. So, her name might mean grandmother snake, or old woman of horror, or the grandmother who makes you shudder, all of which honestly are accurate. But here's the thing about Baba Yaga that makes her different from every other witch we've talked about. She's not consistent at all. In some stories, she's a cannibalistic monster who kidnaps and eats children, crunching their bones with her iron teeth. In other stories, she's a wise woman who helps heroes complete impossible tasks, offering magical gifts and sage advice. Sometimes she's both in the same story, depending on how the hero treats her. Scholar Andreas Johns, who wrote an entire book about her, describes Baba Yaga as a many-faceted figure capable of inspiring researchers to see her as a cloud, moon, death, winter, snake, bird, pelican, or earth goddess, totemic matriarchal ancestress, female initiator, phallic mother, or archetypal image. That's not a figure. That's an entire cosmology compressed into one old woman. So, who is she really? Well, all of it. That's the point. Baba Yaga contains multitudes. Let's talk about what she looks like, because the descriptions are wonderfully specific and deeply weird. She's old, ancient, skeletal in many depictions, thin to the point where you can see her bones through her papery skin. Some stories say she's so thin that she's almost insubstantial, more spirit than flesh. Her nose is long, extremely long, sometimes touching the ceiling when she sleeps. It's hooked and pointed, and in the most vivid descriptions, it's described as beak-like, which connects her to birds, to creatures that exist between earth and sky. Her teeth are made of iron or sometimes stone. Either way, they're not normal human teeth. They're tools, weapons, capable of crunching through bone, yes, but also symbolically connecting her to the earth, to metal, to things forged and ancient. Her hair is wild and unkempt, sometimes described as scraggly and gray, other times as having a life of its own, moving like snakes or smoke. But here's the most important part, the detail that makes Baba Yaga instantly recognizable. She flies, but not on a broomstick like Western witches. No, Baba Yaga flies in a giant mortar, like the bowl you'd use to grind grain or herbs, and she steers with a pestle, the grinding tool. As she flies, she sweeps away her tracks with a broom made of birch or silver birch. Can you picture it? This skeletal old woman crammed into a huge stone mortar, using a pestle like an oar to propel herself through the sky, erasing evidence of her passage as she goes. It's absurd and terrifying, and somehow perfect. The mortar and pestle aren't random details. They're grinding tools, instruments of transformation, of taking something in one form and breaking it down into another, which is exactly what Baba Yaga does. She's a transformer, a threshold figure, someone who takes you apart and puts you back together different. And then there's her house. Oh, her house! It stands on chicken legs, sometimes two legs, sometimes one giant leg, sometimes multiple legs. These aren't cute little decorative chicken feet. These are massive, scaly, powerful legs that allow the house to walk around the forest, to run even when necessary. The house can spin. It rotates on those legs, and the door doesn't face you until you say the right words. The traditional phrase varies by region, but it's usually something like, little hut, turn your back to the forest and your front to me. And the house, because it's alive, it has agency, will consider your request, and then maybe if it feels like it will turn around and let you in. Inside the space is often described as being much larger than it should be, which is classic magical dwelling stuff. But more notably, there's always a stove, a huge Russian stove that takes up a significant portion of the house. And Baba Yaga is often found lying on top of this stove, which is the warmest spot in the house and the traditional place where Russian grandmothers would rest. See, even in her most monstrous depictions, there are these little touches of ordinary domesticity. She's terrifying, but she's also just an old woman staying warm. The fence around her house, though, that's where the domesticity ends. It's made of human bones. The posts are leg bones. The crossbars are arm bones, and the skulls on top serve as lanterns glowing from within with an eerie light. Some versions say these skulls have the power to kill anyone who looks at them if Baba Yaga wills it. It's a warning, a very clear message. This is not a safe place. These are the remains of people who came before you. You might join them, but And this is crucial. You might not. Because Baba Yaga doesn't kill everyone who visits her. That's not how she works. Let me tell you the most famous Baba Yaga story, because it illustrates her perfectly. It's called Vasilisa the Beautiful, and it goes like this. There's a young girl named Vasilisa whose mother died, but before dying gave her daughter a magical doll. "Keep this doll with you always," the mother said. "Feed it, and when you need help, it will guide you." Vasilisa's father remarried because of course he did. This is a fairy tale, and the stepmother was cruel. She had 2 daughters of her own, and together they made Vasilisa's life miserable. Classic evil stepmother situation. One day, the stepmother sent Vasilisa into the forest to get light from Baba Yaga. This was basically a death sentence. Nobody expects you to return from Baba Yaga's house. But Vasilisa went, guided by her magical doll. She found the hut on chicken legs, said the magic words, and was admitted. And Baba Yaga, instead of immediately eating her, gave her a deal. "You can stay," Baba Yaga said, "but you must complete tasks. If you succeed, I'll give you fire. If you fail." She didn't need to finish that sentence. The fence full of skulls made the consequences pretty clear. So Baba Yaga gave Vasilisa impossible tasks. Separate poppy seeds from dirt, millions of them. Clean the house, cook elaborate meals, all in one night. And here's where it gets interesting. Vasilisa couldn't have done it alone. But she had the doll, her dead mother's gift. And the doll helped her. The doll did most of the work while Vasilisa rested. When morning came, everything was done perfectly. Baba Yaga was impressed, or at least not displeased. She asked Vasilisa how she'd accomplished everything. "My mother's blessing," Vasilisa said. And Baba Yaga, this terrifying cannibal witch, recoiled. "A blessing," she said. "I want no blessed people in my house. Leave, go." But she also gave Vasilisa what she'd come for. Light, a skull from her fence glowing with fire. "Take this," she said. "It's what you came for." Vasilisa took the skull and left. And when she got home, the skull's light was so pure and hot that it burned up her stepmother and stepsisters. They were consumed by the very light they'd sent Vasilisa to fetch. Now, what does this story tell us about Baba Yaga? First, she keeps her word. She said she'd give fire if the tasks were completed, and she did. Second, she has rules, and she follows them. She doesn't want blessed people in her house. That's her boundary, and she enforces it, even when it means letting potential prey escape. Third, she's not randomly evil. She punished the stepmother and stepsisters indirectly by giving Vasilisa exactly what they asked for. The light killed them because they were wicked. Vasilisa was fine. Fourth, she tests people. The tasks weren't really about completing chores. They were about showing resourcefulness, humility, cleverness. Vasilisa passed because she was humble enough to accept help and smart enough to not reveal too much. Baba Yaga is a teacher, a harsh one, sure, with very high stakes, but a teacher nonetheless. This is reinforced in other stories. Heroes come to Baba Yaga seeking magical objects or knowledge, and she gives them tests. If they're respectful, if they're brave, if they're clever, she helps them. She might even give them magical gifts, an enchanted horse, a ball of thread that shows the way, advice on how to defeat a greater enemy. But if they're rude, if they're cowardly, if they're stupid, well, into the stove they go. There's a Russian folk song that calls her the Winter Witch. The lyrics go something like, "Son, you saw the old Yaga, Baba Yaga, the Winter Witch, this ferocious woman. She escaped spring. She fled away from the just. She brought cold in a bag. She shook cold on earth. So she's connected to winter like Perchta and Gryla. She brings the cold. She is the harsh season personified. But unlike those figures who became purely threatening, Baba Yaga retained her dual nature. Scholars have theories about why. Some think she's a remnant of an ancient goddess, possibly a death goddess or earth goddess. Others see her as a female shaman figure, someone who exists on the boundaries of normal society and has power because of that liminal position. The chicken-legged hut, for instance, might represent a Slavic burial practice where the dead were placed in small huts raised on posts, creating the illusion of a house on legs. Baba Yaga would then be the guardian of the threshold between life and death. Her flying mortar, that's a shamanic symbol. The mortar and pestle are tools of transformation, and flight is the classic shamanic ability to traverse different realms of existence. The forest itself is significant. In Slavic folklore, the forest is not safe human space. It's wild, dangerous. It's where civilization ends and chaos begins. Baba Yaga lives right at that boundary. She is the forest's representative, nature's avatar. When you go to her, you're stepping outside the normal world into a place where different rules apply, where dead mothers can leave magical protection, where houses walk, where your character determines whether you live or die. And maybe that's why Baba Yaga has remained so popular, so resonant even today. She represents something true about transformation, real growth, real change, real wisdom. It doesn't come easy. It requires tests. It requires going into the dangerous forest and facing the scary witch. It requires proving yourself. But if you do prove yourself, if you're brave and clever and respectful of forces greater than you come out transformed. You come out with fire, with knowledge, with power you didn't have before. Baba Yaga has variants throughout Slavic regions. In Serbia and Croatia, she's called Baba Roga. In Poland, Baba Jinza. The details change. Sometimes she's more monstrous, sometimes less, but the core remains. An old woman with power living outside normal society, testing those who seek her out. And in a 2014 collection of stories called Into the Forest, Tales of the Baba Yaga, editor Lindy Ryan wrote, "The essence of Baba Yaga exists in many cultures and many stories, and symbolizes the unpredictable and untamable nature of the female spirit of Mother Earth and the relationship of women to the wild." She went on to say, "She's a shamanic trickster, a category and boundary crosser, a reminder that freedom lies a little beyond the border of social norms, and that we can learn as much from the dark as the light." That's Baba Yaga in a nutshell. She's wild, untamed, unpredictable. She can't be controlled or domesticated or made safe. She is what she is, and you deal with her on her terms or not at all. And I think that's why modern feminists have embraced her as a kind of icon. Not because she's a nice representation of feminine power. She's not nice at all. But because she's powerful on her own terms, she doesn't apologize. She doesn't soften herself to be more acceptable. She doesn't need approval from any patriarchal authority. She lives alone in the forest, does whatever she wants, and if you don't like it, well, there's always room for another skull on her fence. There's something deeply satisfying about that, especially for women who've been told their whole lives to be nice, to be accommodating, to not take up too much space. Baba Yaga takes up exactly as much space as she wants. She's loud when she wants to be. She's scary when she wants to be. She helps when she feels like it and destroys when she feels like it. She's free in a way that most figures, especially female figures in folklore, never get to be. Now, does any of this connect to Christmas? Not directly. Baba Yaga isn't a Christmas witch the way Befana or Gryla became, but she is absolutely a winter figure. The cold, the darkness, the time when nature is most dangerous. That's her season. And in the same way that other cultures developed specific winter goddesses who later got absorbed into Christmas traditions, Baba Yaga represents that same ancient understanding that winter is powerful, feminine, and not to be trifled with. She's the grandmother of all winter witches in a sense, the purest, most undiluted version of what these figures represent. Nature's power, winter's threat, the wisdom that comes from surviving many seasons, and the danger inherent in transformation. Every culture needed their version of her. Some kept her scary and made her a Christmas boogeyman. Some softened her and made her a gift giver. But they all needed that archetype. The powerful old woman who knows things, who tests you, who lives outside society's rules. Baba Yaga just had the good fortune to exist in a culture that let her keep both aspects, the helpful and the terrifying, in balance. The witch who might help you, who might eat you, who won't decide until she's tested you. And honestly, that's more realistic than most fairy tales, because life is like that, isn't it? The challenges you face might destroy you or transform you, and you don't always know which until you're in the middle of them. The teachers who push you hardest might be the ones who help you most, but they're not going to be gentle about it. Baba Yaga is the universe in witch form, indifferent to your comfort, but responsive to your courage, ready to reward or devour depending on what you bring to the encounter. She's still here, by the way, still showing up in books, movies, video games, art. The John Wick movies named their assassin organization after her. The comic book Hellboy featured her multiple times. She appears in everything from children's books to literary fiction to horror stories. She's endlessly adaptable because she's endlessly mysterious. The John Wick movies call him the boogeyman, but Baba Yaga is female and not exactly a boogeyman. But whatever, it sounds cool. Baba Yaga has become a trope, a recognizable character type, the scary witch in the forest who might help or might hurt you. Writers use her as shorthand without necessarily understanding or caring about the actual folklore. Is this cultural appropriation, cultural evolution, both? Here's what I think. Commercialization is how mythology survives in capitalist societies. It's not ideal. It's not respectful. It flattens and simplifies and strips away meaning. But it's also how stories spread, how they reach new audiences, how they adapt to new contexts. The alternative, keeping these traditions pure and authentic and untouched by commerce, sounds nice. But it also means they become museum pieces preserved in amber, appreciated by scholars and traditionalists, but disconnected from living culture. So maybe the commercialized Krampus, silly as he is better than no Krampus at all. Maybe the tourist-friendly Befana festivals, shallow as they might seem, are better than Befana being completely forgotten. But we lose something in the transaction. We lose the genuine fear, the real meaning, the cultural context that made these figures important. We turn terror into nostalgia. We make the dangerous cute. We transform the sacred into the sellable. And maybe that's just what happens when every culture becomes global, when every tradition becomes accessible, when every story becomes marketable content. But here's what concerns me. When we strip away the fear, when we make these figures safe and consumable, we also strip away their power to teach us things. Berchta taught about the importance of completed work of community responsibility. Gryla taught about respecting the power of winter and the land. Befana taught about missed opportunities and eternal seeking. Baba Yaga taught about respecting power you don't understand. But plush toy Krampus, cute Befana fridge magnets, video game Baba Yaga, they don't teach anything except that you can buy a version of culture without engaging with it. We collect these figures like Pokemon. Got to catch them all. Got to buy the merchandise from every culture. But we don't necessarily learn from them. We don't let them change us. We just consume them. And Christmas itself, the whole season, has become the ultimate example of this. It's the biggest shopping season of the year. The entire economy depends on Christmas sales, Black Friday, Cyber Monday, the desperate scramble to buy enough presents to prove you love people. We've turned a celebration of light returning, of the year renewing, of survival through darkness. We've turned that into a frenzy of consumption. The original meaning, community, survival, facing darkness together, has been replaced with individual purchasing power. Your value is measured by how much you can buy. The quality of your Christmas is determined by the gifts under your tree, and the figures that once embodied real fears and real values, they're just branding now. Different flavors of Christmas. Traditional Santa for the mainstream. Krampus for the edgy types. Befana if you want to seem cultured. Yule Lads if you want to seem quirky. We've taxonomized terror and turned it into market segments. Is there a way back? Can we reclaim the genuine meaning while still participating in modern global culture? I don't know. Maybe not completely. We can't unforget what we've forgotten. We can't uncommercialize what's been sold. The genie is out of the bottle, and the genie is wearing a price tag. But maybe we can be more conscious, more intentional. Maybe we can buy the Krampus mug, but also learn the actual story. Maybe we can attend the Perchta, but also understand what it originally meant. Maybe we can enjoy the commercialized versions, while also respecting the traditions they came from. Maybe we can participate in the market while refusing to let the market define everything. Because here's the thing, these stories survived everything else. They survived the church's persecution. They survived centuries of suppression and transformation. They survived being turned into monsters and threats and cautionary tales. They can probably survive being turned into merchandise too. The question is, can they survive it with their meaning intact? Or will future generations only know the sanitized, commercialized versions? Will they grow up thinking Krampus is just the funny, scary Christmas guy without understanding the deeper cultural context? That's up to us. That's a choice we make every time we engage with these stories. Do we just consume them, or do we try to understand them? Do we buy the thing and move on, or do we dig deeper, learn more, respect the origins? Because these figures, Perchta, Gryla, Befana, Baba Yaga, all of them, they were never just stories. They were never just entertainment. They are how communities taught values, processed fears, survived difficulties, maintained cohesion. They were functional mythology. They did work. And if we strip away that function, if we reduce them to just aesthetic choices, to just consumer products, what are we left with? Pretty pictures, clever merchandise, empty traditions. Is that enough? Is that what we want to pass on? Or is there something more we should be doing? Something more we should be preserving, learning, honoring? Because behind all the commercialization, behind all the marketing and merchandise and tourist attractions, there are still real stories. Stories about real people who faced real darkness and created meaning to survive it. Stories that taught survival, resilience, community, respect. Those stories still exist. They're still accessible, but we have to choose to look for them. We have to choose to learn them. We have to choose to value them as more than just content to consume. And that brings us to something we haven't fully confronted yet: the cost of all this. Not the monetary cost. We've talked plenty about money, but the human cost. The price paid by real people, real women, real victims of actual witch hunts who got caught in the machinery of fear and superstition and persecution. Because while we've been talking about folklore and commercialization and cultural evolution, we've been dancing around something darker, something that isn't mythology at all, something that actually happened to actual people. There's a woman named Anna Goldie, and I need you to remember her name. Not because she was famous, not because she was powerful, but because she was the last person officially executed for witchcraft in Europe. It happened in 1782, not 1582, not in the medieval period. 1782, the same year America was winning its revolution, the same era that gave us Mozart and the Enlightenment, and people like Voltaire writing about reason and rationality. The modern world was being born, and Europe was still killing women for witchcraft. Anna Goldie was 48 years old. She'd been born into poverty in Zenwald, Switzerland. She'd had an illegitimate child with a mercenary. The child died in infancy. She spent her life working as a servant in various households, always on the edge of survival, always vulnerable. In 1780, she was hired by Johann Jakob Wickli, a respected physician and magistrate in the town of Glarus. She worked in his household for 2 years, and then his 8-year-old daughter started having what we'd now probably recognize as seizures or some kind of neurological condition. She would spit up needles and pins, or claim to. Her family believed her. The family needed someone to blame. They chose Anna. The official charge wasn't witchcraft. By 1782, that was becoming legally problematic, even in Switzerland. So they charged her with poisoning the child. But everyone knew what it really was. The trial documents described supernatural elements. The girl's affliction was attributed to Anna's malevolent influence. Anna was tortured. She confessed because that's what torture does. It produces confessions. Then she recanted when the torture stopped. Then they tortured her again. She confessed again. On June 13, 1782, Anna Goldie was beheaded. The authorities knew this looked bad. They knew Europe was moving past witch trials, so they tried to keep it quiet. The execution records were sealed. The case was classified as poisoning, not witchcraft. They were embarrassed, but everyone knew. And now we remember her. In 2008, over 200 years later, the Swiss parliament officially exonerated Anna Goldie. They acknowledged that she'd been executed for witchcraft, that it was unjust, that it was murder sanctioned by the state. Better late than never, I suppose. Though it didn't help Anna much. She's the last official execution, but she's just one of tens of thousands. Let me tell you about some of the others, because they weren't mythology. They weren't folklore figures. They were real women with real names who died real deaths. Walpurga Hausmannen from Dillingen, Germany, she was executed in 1587, and we have the complete trial transcript. It's horrifying in its detail. Walpurga was a midwife. She was 67 years old, widowed for years, supporting herself through her practice. And when several babies died during or after difficult births, because babies died a lot in the 16th century, from causes nobody understood, she got accused. The charges were elaborate. They accused her of killing 40 infants over 19 years, of making ointments from the corpses of unbaptized babies, of attending witches' sabbaths and having sex with demons, of causing hailstorms that destroyed crops, wild stuff, impossible stuff. But under torture, Walpurga confessed to all of it. The transcript records her screaming during the torture sessions, records her begging, records her saying whatever they wanted to hear just to make it stop. They executed her by burning. But first, because they were merciful, they had her body torn apart with red-hot pincers. The transcript describes this in excruciating detail. Every stage of her suffering was recorded by a clerk carefully documenting her destruction. Why? Because she was a midwife. Because she had knowledge about birth and women's bodies. Because babies died and someone needed to be blamed. Because she was old and widowed and vulnerable. Her real crime was existing while female, old, and unsupported. Let's talk about the Bamberg witch trials, 1626 to 1631. 5 years, one small German city, and approximately 1,000 people were executed for witchcraft. 1,000 people in 5 years in one city. The Prince Bishop of Bamberg, Johann Georg II, Fuchs von Dornheim, believed that witches were everywhere. He built a special prison, the Drudenhaus, the witch prison, just for holding accused witches. It had torture chambers in the basement, purpose-built facilities for extracting confessions. Among the victims was Johannes Junius, the mayor of Bamberg. Yes, the mayor. Being male and powerful didn't protect him once the accusations started. He was arrested in 1628, tortured extensively, and executed. But before he died, he managed to smuggle a letter out of prison to his daughter. It's one of the most heartbreaking documents from the entire witch trial period. He wrote, "Many 100,000 good nights, dearly beloved daughter Veronica. Innocent have I come into prison. Innocent have I been tortured. Innocent must I die." He described his torture, the thumb screws that crushed his hands, the leg vices that shattered his bones, the strappado being hung by your arms behind your back until your shoulders dislocate. He wrote, "And then came also, God in highest heaven, have mercy the executioner, and put the thumb screws on me, both hands bound together, so that the blood ran out at the nails and everywhere, so that for 4 weeks I could not use my hands." He explained that he only confessed because he couldn't bear more torture, that he made up names of other witches because the torturers demanded names, that none of it was true, but truth didn't matter anymore. He ended the letter, "Good night, for your father, Johannes Junius, will never see you more." He was beheaded 3 days later. Can you imagine? Can you imagine being tortured until you confess to things you didn't do, then being executed for those confessions, and your last act is writing to your daughter to tell her you're innocent? The Würzburg witch trials, 1626 to 1631, same period as Bamberg, different city, executed at least 900 people. In 1629, at the peak of the hysteria, children made up 60% of those accused. Children, some as young as 3 years old, 3-year-olds accused of witchcraft, 3-year-olds tortured for confessions, 3-year-olds killed. What do you even do with that information? How do you process that humans did this to each other, to children? The Trier witch trials in Germany, 1581 to 1593, killed 368 people. It was called perhaps the biggest witch trial in European history by contemporary observers. The Archbishop of Trier, Johann von Schönenberg, believed witchcraft explained everything bad happening in his region. Crop failures, witches, disease, witches, political unrest, witches. He unleashed systematic persecution that depopulated entire villages. One village, I don't even know its name, just that it existed, reportedly had only 2 women left alive by the time the trials moved on. 2 out of what had been a functioning community. And here's something that makes it worse. The trials were profitable. Accusers and executioners were paid per conviction. The accused property was confiscated and used to fund more trials. There was financial incentive to keep finding witches. It was a self-perpetuating system of terror and profit. In Scotland, between 1563 and 1736, approximately 4,000 people were accused of witchcraft. About 1,500 were executed. Scotland was particularly vicious about it. They burned witches alive rather than beheading them first, like some other regions did. The Scottish witch trials were different in one way. They kept incredibly detailed records. We have documentation of accusations, trials, confessions, executions, names, ages, locations, dates, which means we can see patterns. We can see that most victims were women, most were over 40, most were poor, most were accused by neighbors they'd had disputes with. Most confessed only under torture. Most died screaming that they were innocent. We can see that this wasn't a few isolated incidents. This was systematic. This was bureaucratic. This was normalized violence against vulnerable women, sanctioned by church and state, carried out by communities that believed they were protecting themselves. In Poland, the last mass witch trial happened in 1775. 14 women were arrested in a village accused of using magic to harm the wife of a local nobleman. 3 died under torture. The rest were burned at the stake. This execution was so shocking, even for 1775, that it led the Polish government to ban both torture and witch trials the following year, in 1776. Think about that timeline. America's Declaration of Independence, 1776. Poland banning witch trials, 1776. Same year. The modern world being born while the medieval world was still dying. Now, you might be wondering, did anyone try to stop this? Did anyone speak up? Some did. Not many, but some. Friedrich Spee, a Jesuit priest in Germany, served as a confessor to accused witches. He heard their confessions before execution, and what he heard over and over were innocent people who'd been tortured into false confessions. In 1631, he published Cautio Criminalis, Precaution for Prosecutors, arguing that witch trials were fundamentally unjust. That torture produced false confessions, that the whole system was corrupt. He published it anonymously because he knew what happened to people who opposed witch trials. Even so, his own order censured him. His superiors were furious that he'd questioned the trials. But the book circulated. It was read. It influenced some legal thinkers. It didn't stop the trials. They continued for more than a century after, but it planted seeds of doubt. There were a few judges who refused to convict, a few towns that resisted the hysteria, a few voices saying, "This is wrong." But mostly there was silence. Or worse, there was support because people believed. They genuinely believed that witches were real, that they were dangerous, that they needed to be eliminated. The same communities that created beautiful art, sophisticated theology, complex legal systems, those same communities tortured and killed women for witchcraft. Humans are capable of incredible cruelty, especially when we're afraid, especially when we've convinced ourselves that cruelty is necessary. especially when we can point to authority figures, priests, judges, books, who tell us that what we're doing is right. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Many of the accusations came from ordinary people, from neighbors, from family members. The church and state provided the legal framework, but communities provided the accusations. Someone had to point the finger first. Someone had to say, I think she's a witch, and that someone was usually another villager, another woman, another scared, struggling human looking for someone to blame. The witch trials weren't imposed from above onto unwilling populations. They emerged from communities that wanted explanations, wanted scapegoats, wanted to feel like they could control the uncontrollable. It's easy to blame the church, the state, the institutions, and they are culpable. They created and enforced the legal machinery of persecution. But we can't ignore that regular people participated. Regular people accused, regular people testified, regular people watched the executions. This wasn't done to them. This was done by them to their own. And that's the most disturbing lesson. Given the right conditions, enough fear, enough uncertainty, enough authority telling us it's okay. We're all capable of becoming witch hunters. We like to think we'd be different, that we'd see through the hysteria, that we'd stand up for the innocent. But history suggests otherwise. Most people don't resist. Most people conform. Most people go along with whatever their society defines as normal, even when that normal includes burning women alive. So, when we look back at the witch trials, we're not just looking at past atrocities. We're looking at human nature, at what we're capable of when fear overrides reason, when authority overrides conscience, when the need for explanations overrides truth. And the question we have to ask, the question that should make us deeply uncomfortable, is what modern witch hunts are we participating in right now? What contemporary scapegoating have we normalized? Who are we marginalizing, persecuting, dehumanizing, because it makes us feel safer? Because the mechanisms that drove witch trials, fear, scapegoating, moral panic, dehumanization of the other, authority sanctioning persecution, those mechanisms still exist. The technology changes, the targets change, but the underlying pattern is depressingly consistent. We point at history and say, thank God we're past that. But are we? Or have we just changed which groups we're willing to persecute? That's not a rhetorical question. That's something we need to genuinely examine. Because if we don't understand how witch hunts happened, really understand, not just as historical curiosity, but as warning, we're doomed to repeat them. And somewhere in an unmarked grave, in Switzerland or Germany or Scotland or Poland, Anna Gildy and Walpurga Hausmannen and thousands of women whose names we don't even know anymore, they're waiting for us to learn the lesson. They died for nothing, for lies, for hysteria, for fear. The least we can do is remember them. And more than that, the least we can do is learn from them. Learn what happens when fear becomes policy, when superstition becomes law, when persecution becomes normalized, because their deaths should mean something, should teach us something, should make us better. Otherwise, what was the point of any of it? What's the point of studying history if we don't let it change us? So I want to end this section by saying their names, just a few of them, just so they're not just numbers, not just statistics in the history of atrocity. Anna Gildy, Walpurga, Hausmannen, Johannes Junius, and thousands of others whose names are lost, but whose suffering was real, whose innocence was clear, whose deaths were murders, remember them. And now, having confronted the darkest part of this story, having seen what happens when mythology becomes persecution, when fear becomes death, we have one more question to answer, one more piece to examine, because we've traced these winter witches from goddesses to monsters to merchandise to martyrs. We've seen how they changed and why they changed, and who paid the price. But what does it all mean? What are we supposed to do with these stories now? How do we honor the truth of what happened while also acknowledging the power these figures still hold? How do we move forward with eyes open to both the magic and the murder, the mythology and the atrocity? That's where we're heading, to the end, to the meaning, to what these Christmas witches and everything they represent can teach us about surviving darkness, both ancient and modern. We've come a long way together tonight. From ancient goddesses shining in the winter darkness to corporations selling plush toys. From women who protected forests and guided souls to women who were tortured and burned alive. From mythology to history to merchandise to memory. And now we're here at the end of this long, dark, strange journey. And you might be asking, what was the point? Why spend hours exploring these winter witches, these Christmas monsters, these figures that most people have never heard of or think about only as quirky folklore? I'll tell you why. Because these stories, all of them, from Berchta to Befana to Gryla to Baba Yaga, from the goddesses to the victims, they're not really about the past. They're about right now, about us, about the world we're living in and the choices we're making every single day. Let me show you what I mean. Right now, as I'm speaking, there are moral panics happening around the world. Groups being scapegoated, vulnerable populations being blamed for societal problems, people being othered, dehumanized, persecuted, all because fear is a powerful drug, and humans will do almost anything when we're afraid enough. The targets change, the specifics change, but the pattern is the same one that drove witch trials. Fear plus uncertainty plus authority figures sanctioning persecution equals atrocity. We see it in how migrants and refugees are talked about as invaders, as threats, as less than human. We see it in how trans people are being targeted in some countries, accused of corrupting children, of being dangerous, of deserving persecution. We see it in how women who speak up about harassment or assault get called liars, attention seekers, witches. That last word isn't metaphorical. Women in public life still get called witches when they're seen as too powerful, too outspoken, too unwilling to submit. The language has barely changed in 400 years. And when we participate in those moral panics, when we share that inflammatory post, when we repeat that dehumanizing rhetoric, when we stay silent while others are persecuted, we're witch hunters. We might not be lighting fires, but we're gathering the wood. That's the uncomfortable truth these stories force us to confront. The witch trials didn't happen because people in the past were stupid or evil. They happened because people were scared, and scared people are dangerous, and we're scared now. Climate change, economic instability, political polarization, pandemic fallout, rapid technological change, making the world feel alien and uncontrollable. We have plenty of reasons to be scared. The question is, what do we do with that fear? Do we let it turn us into witch hunters? Or do we learn from history and choose differently? Because here's what the winter witches actually teach us if we're paying attention. First, female power is natural. It's not monstrous. It's not supernatural. It's not something that needs to be controlled or contained. The fact that societies spent centuries turning powerful women into literal monsters tells us more about those societies than about the women. Berchta was a protector before the church made her a belly slitter. Gryla embodied Iceland's harsh reality, and Iceland respected her for it. Befana found a way to be useful and beloved. Baba Yaga tested people and rewarded the worthy. These weren't stories about how women are dangerous. They were stories about how women have always had power, knowledge, and authority, and about how patriarchal systems had to work very hard to suppress that truth. Second, old age has value. The fact that these figures are all old women isn't incidental, it's essential. They've accumulated decades of experience, knowledge, survival skills. They've seen multiple winters. They know things. In a world that worships youth, especially female youth, and treats aging as a disease to be fought, these witches remind us that older women are powerful precisely because they're old, because they've survived, because they know. The crone, the hag, the grandmother, these aren't insults. They're badges of honor earned through decades of endurance. Third, winter is real, and we can't make it go away by pretending it isn't there. Our ancestors understood this. They knew winter could kill them. So, they created rituals, told stories, developed survival strategies. They respected winter's power. We've insulated ourselves literally and figuratively from winter's threat. We have central heating and grocery stores, and we think we've conquered nature. But climate change is reminding us nature isn't conquered. We're still subject to forces bigger than us, still vulnerable to the cold, the dark, the uncertain. And maybe that's okay. Maybe vulnerability isn't weakness. Maybe acknowledging that we're small in a big world, that there are things beyond our control, that we need each other to survive. Maybe that's actually wisdom. Fourth, fear is useful, but only if we direct it correctly. Our ancestors were afraid of winter, so they prepared. They finished their work. They gathered resources. They built community bonds. Their fear motivated productive action. But when fear gets directed at people instead of problems, when we fear the witch instead of the winter, that's when it becomes destructive. That's when we start hurting each other instead of helping each other. The trick is learning to fear the right things, not the different, not the powerful, not the old women with knowledge, but the actual threats: hunger, cold, isolation, the real dangers that require real solutions. Fifth, stories survive everything. The church tried to erase these goddesses. Witch trials tried to eliminate the women who carried the knowledge. Capitalism tried to commodify them into meaninglessness. And yet, here we are still talking about them, still feeling their pull, still knowing on some level that they matter. Stories are resilient. They adapt. They hide when they need to. They change form but retain essence. You can't kill a good story. You can only fail to listen to it. And these winter witches, they're very good stories. They've survived for potentially thousands of years because they're telling us something we need to know. Something about power, about survival, about respect, about fear, about community. If we stopped listening, we'd lose something important. Some knowledge that humans have always needed and will always need. So, what do we do with all this? How do we honor these stories? Both the mythology and the history, both the magic and the murder. I think we start by remembering, by refusing to let these stories be flattened into simple holiday decorations or dismissed as primitive superstition. By insisting on the complexity, by saying, yes, these were goddesses, and yes, the church turned them into monsters, and yes, real women died because of it, and yes, we're still dealing with the consequences. All of it is true. All of it matters. We remember Anna Gildi and Walpurga Hausmannen not as statistics, but as people. We remember that witch trials weren't ancient history. They happened in living memory of modernity. We remember that humans are capable of terrible things when we're afraid and when authority tells us it's okay. We remember the original goddesses, the bright ones, the protectors, the powerful women who existed before they were made into monsters. We reclaim that lineage. We say female power isn't monstrous. Female age isn't worthless. Female knowledge isn't witchcraft. It's just knowledge. We participate in modern Christmas traditions. Sure, buy the Krampus mug if you want. But we also learn where these things came from. We don't let commerce erase meaning. We hold on to the deep stuff even as we engage with the surface stuff. We stay aware. We watch for the patterns. We ask ourselves, who is being scapegoated? Who is being blamed for problems they didn't cause? Who is being othered and dehumanized? And we refuse to participate. We refuse to be witch hunters, no matter how good the justification sounds. Because that's the final lesson. The witch hunters always had good justifications. They were protecting children, defending the faith, maintaining social order, fighting evil. They had reasons, they had authority, they had conviction, and they were wrong. So when we're told that some group is dangerous, is threatening our way of life, deserves persecution, we pause. We remember history. We ask, is this real or is this just another witch hunt? And sometimes it's hard to tell. Sometimes the threats are real and complex, and we can't just dismiss everything as moral panic. But we can approach it with humility, with awareness of our own capacity for error, with memory of what happens when fear becomes policy. We can try to be better than our ancestors, not because they were bad people. They weren't. They were just people. But because we have the advantage of hindsight, we can see where they went wrong. We can learn from their mistakes if we choose to. That's the key. We have to choose. Now, I want to end with something I find beautiful about these winter witches. Something hopeful. They survived. Despite everything, despite persecution, suppression, commercialization, modernization, they survived. Berchta is still celebrated in alpine festivals. La Befana still brings gifts to Italian children. Gryla still scares Icelandic kids. Baba Yaga still flies through Russian forests in stories told by grandmothers. They're still here, changed, yes, adapted, absolutely, but here. And that tells me something. The things that matter, the stories that carry truth, the knowledge that humans need, it persists. It finds a way. It survives. Which means maybe we will too. Maybe despite all our fears, all our failures, all the ways we hurt each other and ourselves, maybe the important stuff survives. Maybe the wisdom gets passed down. Maybe each generation learns a little more, does a little better, becomes a little wiser. Or maybe not. Maybe we'll keep making the same mistakes. Maybe the witch hunts will continue under different names. Maybe we won't learn, but I don't think so. I think we're trying. I think we're learning slowly, imperfectly, with many steps backward, but learning. And part of that learning is listening to the old stories. Really listening. Not just consuming them as entertainment, but letting them teach us. Letting them change us. Letting them show us who we are and who we could be. The winter witches in all their forms, from goddesses to monsters to victims to merchandise, they're mirrors. They show us our fears, our power, our cruelty, our resilience. They show us what we're capable of for good and ill. And if we look closely, if we really pay attention, they show us the way forward. Not an easy way, not a comfortable way, but a way that honors truth, respects power, acknowledges darkness while reaching for light. That's what I hope you take from this long night of stories. Not just cool folklore facts to share at parties, but something deeper, some understanding of where we came from, what we're capable of, and what we need to do better. Because winter is still coming. Maybe not the literal winter our ancestors feared, though climate change might bring us closer to that than we'd like, but metaphorical winters, dark times, uncertain times, times when we're tested and scared and looking for answers. And when those times come, when the darkness presses in and we don't know if the light will return, we have a choice. We can huddle in fear and turn on each other, or we can huddle in community and face the darkness together. We can become witch hunters, or we can honor the witches. We can suppress power we don't understand, or we can respect it. We can repeat history, or we can learn from it. The choice, as always, is ours. So here we are at the end. You've been with me for hours now. Thank you for that. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying with these stories even when they got dark, even when they got uncomfortable, even when they asked hard questions. These are the stories that matter, not because they're pleasant or easy, but because they're true. Not literally true. There are no actual women with iron noses flying around slitting bellies, but true in the way that myths are true. True to something in human experience, true to the challenges we face and the choices we make. I hope you'll carry these stories with you, not just as interesting history, but as lessons, as warnings, as reminders of what we're capable of and what we should aspire to. And I hope that when you see Christmas decorations this year, when you hear about Santa Claus and Rudolph and all the sanitized holiday cheer, you'll remember there's another Christmas, a deeper Christmas. A Christmas of winter goddesses and terrifying ogresses and real women who paid real prices. A Christmas that acknowledges darkness alongside light. Both are true. Both are real. This has been a journey into the shadows, and I've been honored to walk it with you. If you found value in these stories, if they meant something to you, I'd love to hear about it. Leave a comment. Share this with someone who might need to hear it. Let these stories spread. Let them survive. Let them do their work, because that's how stories stay alive. Through telling, through sharing, through refusing to let them be forgotten. And speaking of stories that need to be told, this is just the beginning. There are so many more dark corners of history to explore, so many more forgotten voices to remember, so many more lessons hiding in the folklore we've dismissed as mere superstition. So, if you want more of these deep dives into the stories beneath the stories, the history beneath the holidays, the truth beneath the myth, stick around. Subscribe if you haven't already, because I have more stories to tell, more darkness to illuminate, more truth to uncover. The winter witches were just the beginning. There are more whispers in the snow, more secrets in the shadows, more lessons in the darkness. And I'll be here whenever you're ready to listen again. Until then, stay curious, stay critical, stay kind. And remember, the monsters aren't always who we think they are. Sometimes the monsters are the ones hunting witches. Good night and sweet dreams. May your house be clean, your work be finished, and your conscience be clear. And if you hear something on the wind during these 12 days, well, maybe just stay inside just to be safe. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And thank you for carrying these stories forward. Sleep well.